So tell us just briefly lang about that transition from Apple and then being part of the Excel team as an Excel user, one of the early adopters. I want to hear about that. No, any significant stories from that era, and then let's bring it back to the present with AI.
Okay, I will jump right into the part that eventually people ask when they talk about my time in Apple and Microsoft, and that is, did you get to work with Steve and Bill
The legendary
while you were
people.
there, right?
Yeah.
So I'll jump right into that. Yes, and the answer is yes, I did. As you know, even during the time of the Lisa, the Macintosh was already in play, and Steve was the main guy. So my experiences with Steve at that time was very negative because he was very much anti-Lisa. He wanted to kill us basically because he thought that we were threatening the success of Mac, which was still in the future. So it was very negative. He was quite mean to us. So it was not a very positive experience. I learned a lot when I was at Apple. When I was at Apple, they had probably about no more than 5,000 employees. So it was still quite early days, and it was still very much a startup in its culture and the way that things were done. Very few processes defined. As a matter of fact, the entire HR employee policy was 12 pages.
Just
That was
12
employee
pages.
guide, 12 pages, and it was one policy per page. So the 12 policies that HR used to govern employee management was all there. Okay, and Steve wrote it himself.
From the words of Steve Jobs.
Yeah, so that's 5,000. It grew to 5,000 employees, and that was it. So it was very much like a startup. And the two things I learned, and this is very, very rehearsed, Doc, is very, because I've been asked many times. So the first thing I learned is that the personality of the organization is definitely a reflection of the personality of the leader. And if you want to know what a company is like, especially a startup company, all you got to do is evaluate the leader. It's very reflective. No matter, you cannot separate the two. That's my first learning over there. The second learning I had over there is that I was a good programmer. I learned that there because it was a hardware role. I was in a hardware support role, but I discovered in being in hardware support that my real passion was programming. And I remember that in my college days, before I went to work, my final year in college, I had a professor of computer science that was very inspirational. She was a woman who actually had a master's in computer science at a time when there were even very few schools that had a computer science degree, and even IT was unknown as a degree back then. So she was my programming. Actually, the programming language was Fortran. Okay, she was my Fortran professor.
I remember
And
Fortran. I was a
yeah,
Fortran boy too.
yeah. So in my final exam, which I did on paper, not it was written exam on paper. We had to write our code, on graphing paper. She, I got a perfect score, and then in my final exam, she wrote me a note, which was the last thing I ever heard from her because I never saw her again after that. She said, "Joey, this is excellent. Have you ever considered a career in software?"
Seems
And
like an understatement now, no?
yeah, so I read it. I thought, well, that's nice, but promptly forgot it. I wanted to be a hardware engineer. I wanted to work for Boeing. I wanted to work in avionics. I wanted to work for some hardware company. And when I got the offer to work for Apple, I thought that was a dream come true. I was going to work with hardware, and I was going to work with cutting edge microcomputer hardware. So great. But what I learned when I was there was that I was meant to be in software, because the first time I saw Microsoft Excel on the Mac, I said, this is what's going to make a difference in the world. It's not the hardware, it's the
It's the
software.
apps. Yeah.
Yeah. So I quickly taught myself how to program in a Mac, which is basically macro programming languages in Excel. That was before VBA was a thing. VBA didn't come into being until Excel for Windows came out. That's what came out with VBA. So I learned how to program it, and I got so good at it, I started doing moonlighting. I was doing freelance work before freelance was a thing. So I would do freelancing work for these large companies like Pricewaterhouse and back then, before it was a KPMG, they were actually two separate companies. I would do work for them, right? Doing financial modeling in Excel, these huge spreadsheets, and they would tell me, which I didn't know because I'd never done it, they would tell me, Joey, this thing can calculate in less than 5 minutes what is currently taking us almost a day to calculate on our mainframes. And I didn't know how significant that was at the time. But I thought, hey, great, then pay me, pay me good money to do this. So that was
So
the beginning.
spreadsheet engineer, or I don't know what you want to call it
Yeah,
now, right? Okay.
I was a spreadsheet programmer, I guess.
Right.
But
Wait,
that
can
was,
I ask a minutia? Because a lot of
yeah,
people remember Excel, and then before that, they think it's Lotus. Do you remember Multiplan? Were you
yes.
involved in Multiplan?
Multiplan was the precursor to Excel, and there
There
was
you go.
another.
Somebody finally said it. No one
Yeah,
remembers it. No one remembers it.
yeah. And before that, there was the first spreadsheet that Apple had was something called AppleWorks.
Hmm. Yeah, I
That
remember
even
AppleWorks.
preceded Multiplan. Multiplan was the first spreadsheet from Microsoft. AppleWorks was the first spreadsheet from Apple. And so they actually came out. AppleWorks came out shortly after VisiCalc, which is the very
VisiCalc.
first popular successful spreadsheet. VisiCalc, and then you had AppleWorks, and you had Multiplan, which is a tremendous failure.
Mhm.
And then Lotus, of course, Lotus 1 came out, and then finally Excel
Excel.
came in and
Yeah.
killed all of them.
Changed everything, no? Yeah, yeah. So I just wanted to ask you about that. So certainly you were around at the inception of Excel, no?
Yep.
Oh man,
Yep.
we should do another episode just on that. Oh, so maybe I'll ask a few questions just on that. Because I remember when Excel when it's was in its nascent adoption. Because I encountered Excel already in the early 90s. I took accounting. And back then good old fashioned accounting was columnar pads and adding machines. And I was maybe one person in class was saying, hey, you should check out this Microsoft Excel. It's the new thing. No one would believe it. And how hard was it in the early days to encourage adoption? Because I remember people were very resistant in the same way people are resistant about AI today, but let's get to that later. But just in looking at a spreadsheet, because spreadsheets look very different from word processors. Word processors had kind of early adoption already by then, right? But spreadsheets were weird.
In another episode, we can have a discussion about what our customers, when I was at Microsoft Excel, what our customers tried to use Excel for, which it was never meant to be used for. One of them was using it as a word processor because that's what they understood. But that's another topic. You never know whatever product it is that you build, especially when it comes to software. You really never know how people will use it. They will use it in ways that you never imagined. The better the software is, the better built it is, the more likely they're going to do something with it that you did not expect. And
Yeah,
that's even today with
they call it
AI.
edge cases now, right? But before it
Yes.
was like weird stuff.
Yeah, weird stuff. But anyway, so adoption. I would say that there's two views. I would have two views of adoption.
Mhm.
One of them is what you are describing, which was difficult, right? Like get people to go from using the columnar pads and calculators, which they got very good at actually,
Yeah.
to doing it on a spreadsheet. That was back then a really big leap for most people. And today, I guess you could say that it could be the same thing with people who do anything in a business. For example, project planning. You're doing it manually, whatever that manual process is or analog process is. And then now you want to use some kind of, project management software. That's a big jump. Okay. No different than going from accounting, using ledgers to going to an ERP system.
Right.
That's a big jump.
Right.
Okay. So back then, The first view is it was very difficult. I remember working with our evangelists, which we had in Microsoft, trying to evangelize the use of